Hello, I'm Senator Antonio Hayes from the 40th Legislative District here in Baltimore City, along with my co-host, Dr. Williams of Coppin State University Center for Strategic Entrepreneurship. And this is Westside on the Rise. We are excited about our topic today as we go on, and we will talk about many things. For me, we're in the middle of a legislative session. Things are up and away. We have some really important pieces of legislation before us, and one of those pieces of legislation will talk about the adult use of marijuana here in the state of Maryland very shortly. And hopefully from today's broadcast, you'll learn some of the things that's going on. And so without further ado, I'll turn it over to my co-host.
Thank you, Senator Hayes. I'm so glad that we can come together once again on Westside on the Rise and share information about not only what's happening in West Baltimore, but in particular, as you said, what's happening in this legislative session. I also want to make mention, I just left Coppin State University's campus a few minutes ago for the unveiling of the Fannie Jackson Coppin statue. If you have not been on Coppin's campus, it is a beautiful oasis in the West Baltimore, but now we have a statue of our namesake right in the middle of the campus. It is absolutely beautiful. I want to congratulate President Anthony Jenkins and his team for pulling that together. And in case you did not see it, I think it is available on Coppin's website and perhaps Coppin's YouTube channel. His State of the University address that just happened yesterday. So I would encourage you to go out and listen to that State of the University address. It covers everything that is going on with Coppin and all of the accomplishments that have happened over the past couple of years. And it really just illustrates the strength and the power of that anchor institution in West Baltimore and the wonderful trajectory that we're on as we're making an impact. But I'm looking forward to today's session on the adult use of marijuana and that legislation that is in the assembly right now. So I'll pass it back to you, Senator, to get us kicked off.
No, absolutely. And thank you, Dr. Williams. There's a lot of great things happening at Coppin, and by the time this will air, we would have concluded a very successful week over at Coppin. But today's guest, we have Olivia, who is a senior policy analyst with the Marijuana Policy Project. We often refer to it as MPP, the #1 organization in the United States dedicated to legalizing cannabis, having joined the organization in 2017. As legislative analyst, Olivia leads MPP's lobbying efforts to legalize marijuana in Maryland and takes a lead in organizing the Maryland Cannabis Policy Coalition, a group of organizations with shared missions of ending marijuana prohibition in Maryland. She also mentors legislation and advocates for marijuana policy reform in the District of Columbia, Delaware, Virginia, Indiana, Kansas, New Mexico, West Virginia, and Wyoming. Olivia is passionate about criminal justice reforms and holds a Master of Arts degree in criminology from George Washington University. She is a proud native of West Virginia and currently lives in Washington, D.C. Joining Olivia today, we also have Davyon Love. Davyon Love is a Baltimore-based political organizer and the director of public policy for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. We often also refer to them as LBS, a grassroots think tank that advances public policy interests of Black people. In 2010, Love co-founded Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, one of the many organizations that successfully pressured the state of Maryland to disband its plans to build a juvenile jail in downtown Baltimore. LBS has also led successful legislative efforts and advocacy efforts regarding criminal justice reform, as well as youth and community empowerment. Davyon is also the author of Worse Than Trump, The American Plantation, a book that offers an important critique of the American political left and a political alternative to the exploitation relationship that Black people have to white institutions. Davyon is also the author of When Baltimore Awakes, which is a comprehensive critique of the way that white supremacy is embedded in the human and social services sector in Baltimore. And so we welcome both guests with us today.
Welcome, Olivia and Davyon. I am so thankful to have both of you and to have such powerful voices who can speak to this issue. And I can't let the moment go by without saying that Olivia and I are both proud natives of West Virginia and both proud alums of George Washington University. I don't know how the senator worked that out, but no, I welcome you. And Davyon, you also, the powerful work that you're doing in Baltimore, we really are grateful for that. But before we start, Olivia, tell us what drew you to this work? How did you get involved in this work, and what keeps you engaged in this kind of advocacy work?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here and have this conversation with you all. I think for me, it started when I was just a kid. I had family that were victims of the war on drugs. I, like, unfortunately, many folks know the harm that criminalization and incarceration for a non-violent drug offense can cause not only the individual, but their family too. So that personal experience is what really drew me to be interested in the criminal justice system. My academic background's in criminology. So through undergrad and grad school, my worldview was really expanded beyond just my personal experience on just how much damage the war on drugs has caused communities of color. So I became interested in drug policy reform, and cannabis particularly stood out to me because just how unequal enforcement of our cannabis laws has been in this country and continues to be. Nationwide, Black folks are still 4 times as likely to be arrested for simple cannabis possession than white folks, even though they use cannabis at similar rates. So I came to the issue with, a criminal justice and racial justice perspective of, yes, we absolutely should legalize cannabis for adults. It dramatically reduces, police interactions and arrests and criminalization for cannabis. Law enforcement shouldn't be wasting their resources arresting folks for simple cannabis possession. So that was number one for me when I came to the issue, that no one should be criminalized and branded with a criminal record for possessing a plant. And then, as I learned more in the movement, I realized how much further legalization can go from a restorative justice approach. That by legalizing, we also have the opportunity to begin to repair the decades of harm that cannabis prohibition has caused, particularly in communities of color, by including things like expungement, so that people with past cannabis convictions no longer have this burden of a criminal record that we know affects one's ability to obtain employment, housing, professional licenses and other benefits. Legalizing cannabis also comes with tremendous economic opportunities. So it's critical in legalization laws, that we include provisions to make sure that the individuals and communities disproportionately impacted have the opportunity for ownership and employment at every level of the legal industry, and that we reinvest the revenue that we gain from legal sales back into those communities. So those are kind of the things that, brought me to the issue of cannabis legalization, and that I would say continues to fuel my passion and my work at MPP and in Maryland specifically.
Thank you. And I at some point in time, we will pivot back to that personal experience, because I think that there's so many that share that. You know personally the damage that has been done by some of the policies. What about you, Davyon? What drew you to this work and keeps you engaged in this struggle?
So what brought me to the work, so I was actually, as a high school student, a part of a expansion of policy debate around the United States. So the urban debate leads created around the United States policy debate, which is the most rigorous form of academic debate that exists. And when I got to college, I got involved in a period where there was an intellectual and academic innovation in the activity, where folks, Black debaters in the activity were challenging the racism within the research methodology and the pedagogical approach that was being taken in policy debate. And my teacher, a brother named Daryl Birch, who came out of the Pan-African Studies Department of the University of Louisville, studied under Jan Carew, who was a contemporary Malcolm X. So I have, a perspective that is rooted in, kind of revolutionary Pan-Africanist approach that recognizes that the people of African descent, the enslavement of people of African descent was an act of war, right? That we're in a society structured on white supremacy and colonialism, and that for Black people to practice freedom, that we need to be able to build the kind of institutions necessary that are independent, autonomous, and accountable to the masses of Black people. And too often, I think the frame that is often brought to policy and mainstream spaces sees Black people's ability to progress in a society based on our proximity to white institutions, white power, et cetera, as opposed to the importance of building independent power bases such that we can engage the larger political terrain from a position of power and strength. The conversation around cannabis, and as Senator Hayes mentioned in my bio, the conversation around our criticism of the progressive left, because many of the people who are in Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle are not consumers of marijuana. But we understood that one of the challenges was that many of the progressive left were engaging the issue of cannabis legalization in the way that most of the progressive left does, which is understand and frame Black people primarily as victims of oppression and suffering, as opposed to the complete picture, which is the importance of building the institutional wherewithal of Black people. When we talk about repairing the harm done by the war on drugs, Black institutions were decimated as a result of the assault of the war on drugs in our communities, right? There was wealth that was extracted from our community. And so we have to have a meaningful conversation about the importance of building wealth as the basis for what it would actually mean to practice freedom. So the quote I like to use a lot from, Minister Malcolm X, when he says you can't put a knife in a person's back 9 inches, pull it out 3 and say you've made progress. You have to pull it out and begin to heal before we can say we've made progress. And I think too often what has happened is that the progressive left has focused primarily on the importance of the criminal justice aspects of this, the importance of making sure that we deal with people's criminal records, that we change the ways in which law enforcement interacts with our community. But it is important for us to build sustainable power, for us to think about how do we make sure that this multi-billion-dollar industry is one that will allow Black folks to build the wealth necessary so that we have the political power to challenge law enforcement in a way that's more effective. And so that's kind of how LBS comes to this particular topic and the approach that we take on the policy.
Okay, fantastic. And it's just like coming back to at some point the personal experience aspect of it, because I at 17 I was I guess held for trumped up charges for a period of time. That's a whole nother story. But that whole trauma, that and the mentorship that you mentioned, the mentorship. I'm a baby boomer, so I'm from that era. I was born in '58, so I was there, and passing that on, that mentorship piece, I think is tremendously important. Senator Hayes.
No, absolutely. And so let's dig into it. Olivia, there's 2 bills for the legislature this year dealing with the adult use of marijuana. What is the history of these 2 bills, and what are your desired outcomes with this legislative session? We have both HB 1 as well as HB 837.
Yeah, so for context, of the 18 states in DC that have legalized cannabis for adults thus far, most have done so through the ballot initiative process. And some have just legalized legislatively by outright passing a bill. Maryland does not have a ballot initiative process, so the options for Maryland to legalize has always been either through a constitutional amendment that would be referred to the voters. The only other state that has done that approach is New Jersey, or the legislature could just outright pass a bill. So where we're at this legislative session is that the Speaker of the House and the Senate President, they both agree it's time for Maryland to move forward with legalization, which is great. But they do differ in their approach. So House leadership prefers the constitutional voter referendum, which is what HB1 is. It's a constitutional amendment that would refer the question of legalization to voters on the ballot this November in Maryland. And then HB 837 is the House's companion bill to the referendum that spells out, some of the details about how the state will move forward with legalization. It includes details for initial steps for legalization, such as possession limits, expungement, funding for minority and women-owned businesses that would be contingent on voter approval of HB1. So it does not set up a licensing or regulatory system. It doesn't include home cultivation. And under the House proposals, simple possession actually wouldn't become legal until July of 2023. So we have been advocating that any referendum be what we call self-executing, meaning that it would legalize possession and home cultivation immediately when voters approve it, not 8 months later as currently written in the House bill. We also think the bill could go a lot further to address, reducing penalties and collateral consequences for cannabis. Things like specifying the odor of cannabis can't be grounds for a search, reducing the penalty for public smoking if there is a penalty at all. Right now, in the House bill, public smoking would carry up to a $500 fine, which we think is pretty steep. Also, things like reducing penalties for low-level sales, which, as currently written in the House bills, possession with intent to distribute would carry up to 3 years imprisonment. So those are some points that we'd like to see improved in the House bill. And again, these two bills are just what's going on in the House. The Senate has a much more different approach, as I mentioned. So, but one of the other things that we really want to see is contingent companion legislation that actually spells out all the regulatory details and equity details and licensing and revenue distribution that are so important. And it seems like the Senate is much more likely to have those regulatory details that are rooted in social equity and reparative justice. So, the House and Senate are going to have to come to an agreement on how this gets done, and we'll continue to advocate that the final package includes these priorities.
Well, thank you, Olivia, for giving us that insight. And one of the things, Davyon, I'd love for you, Olivia spoke a little bit about the differences and approach that we're doing in the legislature. You and I have worked with my colleague, Senator Carter, on a separate piece of legislation, SB H44. Why don't you talk a little bit about that and, and how does it relate to the racial equity perspective?
Got it. So it's SB 692. And there are a few things that I want to highlight. If I could quickly though, one thing I want to add to what Olivia mentioned about some of the challenges of HB 837, because it's going to apply to what I think we do better in SB 692, which is that the state of Maryland and law enforcement has to make the decision, makes the determination rather, that using marijuana and the presence of marijuana as a law enforcement strategy, they have to decide that that is no longer a legitimate approach. Because part of the reason why there continue to be criminal penalties when there should be none is because law enforcement has been overly reliant on proximity to marijuana as a proxy for criminal behavior. And what we're seeing is up into the thousands of marijuana charges that result in maybe at the most 20 convictions. And the clearance rates of these departments are extremely low in terms of addressing, homicide and violence. So there's going to be a lot of resistance because of the way in which, as a part of legalization, it's dealing with the criminal justice aspect of it, which is actual legalization where criminal penalties are not a part of what the state uses as it relates to dealing with people who possess or distribute cannabis. Because if not, then what's going to happen is that you're going to have law enforcement for whom all the studies show the level of disproportionality in their interactions with Black folks, even though we use the substance in the same proportion to our population, we're going to see that even more exacerbated because it's going to be legal. People won't have it. People may have a little bit more than what the legal possession limit is, right? And then you're going to have, that's going to encourage more law enforcement to interact with Black folks. So that's going to be really important. That's one of the important flaws in HB 837. And one of the things that in Senate Bill 692, that there are no criminal penalties in 692, right, for possession or possession with intent to distribute, right, and that there are also non-monetary alternatives to citations, whether it's community service or other things, for folks who don't have the resources. So that's an important piece. The other piece around the, Black people having access to the industry. So there are two things in the bill that I want to focus on. The first is that we argue that the tax revenues should go back to the communities most impacted by the war on drugs. And the mechanism that we think makes the most sense in doing that is for the 24 jurisdictions to essentially receive direct resources from a fund that the tax revenues come from, 60% of those revenues. The jurisdictions get a percentage of those revenues and that formula is based on how much that jurisdiction contributed to the overall marijuana-related arrests over the past 20 years, right? So the jurisdictions that made a bunch of arrests and that devastated more communities, well, those jurisdictions get more resources based on the past 20 years of data. And that there will be guardrails. So they would be able to use it in ways that will empower the community. Those guardrails would include things like they can't spend it on law enforcement. They can't use it to supplant existing government programs or services, that it has to be directed towards activity that it helps low-income residents. So those are the kind of guardrails that it's put on those resources, so that those dollars, and what it is that those local governing bodies, so city and county councils, would have to pass an ordinance to determine how those resources get spent. That would give the community an opportunity, because I can get in touch with my council person more than I get in touch maybe with my executive, the mayor and county executive. So this would give the community opportunity to weigh in on where those dollars should go, and that's really what reparations is. And that's the approach that we've taken to it, which is the people who are harmed need to be in a position to determine how those resources go. And then lastly, in terms of the regulatory side, which, I think anybody who studied this will recognize that regulatory stuff is tremendously complicated. And the goal that I think many people have articulated as a principle is that a bunch of Black people were locked up as a result. We need to make sure that we get a piece of the pie, right? Part of the limitation is that in legislation, we can't use race-specific language. We have to find ways to get around it. And that's not a problem just with cannabis. I think that's a problem just generally that I think needs to be more directly confronted, because the fact that we can't explicitly use race, right, because of the way in which courts have ruled on the 14th Amendment and the explicit use of race, whether it's in the context of like college admissions or affirmative action, stuff like that, that it impairs the ability for us to explicitly set aside, a certain amount of licenses for Black folks, which would be kind of the most simplest way to do it. And so because that is not, because that's something that is legally controversial, one of the things that we've advocated for on the regulatory side is a point system that more heavily rates licensees or applicants rather, for whom are majority owned by folks who are members of a group disproportionately negatively impacted by cannabis prohibition. I think the sociological data on that is so clearly skewed towards Black folks that we hope that language can circumvent the challenge of using race-specific language. In addition to that, investing in an existing small business fund. So there's a small business fund, a small minority women business fund. There are 8 fund managers throughout the state of Maryland. It's an existing structure that currently provides capital to small businesses, to Black businesses, et cetera. And so instead of building, and that's the last thing I'll say, other bills create a social equity fund. We actually think that that's duplicative, that there's a tremendous amount of existing Black entities that actually work with our community on a regular basis that should receive investment in helping entrepreneurs get access to the industry, as opposed to creating what essentially would be a new nonprofit within the government infrastructure. And so instead of creating this new infrastructure to invest in what we currently have, and that's actually one of the things that I like about HB 837. One of the things that I like is that in it does say that agencies can partner with minority serving institutions in order to help give out grants and resources. So that's actually something that I think is on that portion is a step in the direction that I think makes more sense than the social equity framework that has been put forward in a few bills that have been put forward the past few years.
Davyon, you put so much into just a few minutes. I wish, I don't, I don't know if, educating the public, I think is a big part of should be a big part of the strategy, and getting this kind of information out, and putting it out in such a way that, it's consumable, people understand it, they can connect the dots. They can not only see how we got where we are, but also begin to think and strategize about how we can get out. That whole part that you mentioned about minority serving institutions and getting connected to minority serving institutions, allowing them to be part of the solution, embedded in the community, have a certain amount of trust collateral with the community, and community can help in the education process. Having been at Coppin for 25 years, I think that is absolutely essential to be done. What I would like for you to do also is, we know that this did not just start. I mean, it's a complicated issue. It's going to take time and understanding and persistence to get out of it, but it did not just start. So let's try to put this into a historical context for the people. The war on drugs, 50 years ago, Nixon administration, but it didn't just start then. It seems like the criminal justice system has been weaponized against Black and brown bodies ever since we've been in the Western Hemisphere. So if you can say something about that trajectory, regardless of how far you go back, and how we got to where we are, because I think that helps people put it in context so that they can see path forward.
So there are two historical markers I'll use. The first is 1831, Nat Turner, the rebellion in Southampton, Virginia, right? It was a slave rebellion. And one of the things when you read the news reports of how it was covered, that Nat Turner and his crew were described as deranged criminals who were bloodthirsty. Now, it's interesting because, 50 years prior, there was this thing called the Revolutionary War, right? Where, the American colonists felt tyranny of the British and took up arms against the British. They're heralded as heroes, right? But Nat Turner decides to engage in rebellion against those that are enslaving Africans, and he's deranged and criminal. So the very act of Black people aspiring for true freedom has been criminalized, right? And so that's one marker. The other is that in 1908, a brother named Kelly Miller, who was the first Black person to attend Johns Hopkins, he didn't finish. And he was at one point in the American Negro Academy. He wrote a book in 1908 called Race Adjustments. And in it, he's refuting a text written by a Black person. This is after Reconstruction, right? During the wave in which the Ku Klux Klan and just a white terrorist backlash against the progress of Reconstruction. And what happens, he basically writes a book refuting a Black man who had written a book basically developing or articulating criminogenic notions of Black people being inherently pathological and prone to violence. And that the reason that was happening is because they should have never let Black people have freedom. Letting Black people have freedom, what that meant was that they were releasing a criminal element. Right. And so any rises in crime were attributed to the fact that Black people should have never been free. And so these notions of Black people as inherently prone to violence, as inherently pathological, permeates every aspect of civil society. In fact, I argue that the messages and propaganda that we're exposed to on a regular basis, you can't be socialized in this society without developing and internalizing the notion of Black people as being inherently violent and criminal. Because those are the narratives that are the most salient and projected to us on a day-to-day basis. And so when you mentioned Nixon and one of his chief aides, John Ehrlichman, who understood that a political strategy, if you associate Black people with criminality, that would yield a response from, what was at the time called the silent majority, right? Those blue dog, Reagan Democrats, who were upset at the gains that Black people had made as a result of the freedom movements of the 60s and early 70s. And we see that reflected today. It's a brother named Tony Weaver who did a report published a few years ago that talked about, that did a literature review on a variety of different studies of how Black folks are perceived. And in it, one of the things that it found was that policies that appear to be harsher on Black people than everyone else, those policies are viewed more favorably by whites in this society, right? So just drawing that continuity, that helps us to explain why it is that the war on drugs was such an effective weapon, because it drew on the reservoir of anti-Blackness that's so embedded in our society that for most people, notions of anti-Blackness and Black inferiority are rational beliefs, because that's how normalized it is in the context of the society we live in.
Yeah, those narratives are still alive and well in the society. And what Olivia, this what about public policy answers, solutions? The legislation here in Maryland, that's one law, one session, one state. What about a more comprehensive public policy strategy to deal with this issue, but a broad number of issues based on the outcomes of what Davyon just described?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I have to say thank you so much for conceptualizing that history, because I think it is so important. I think Davyon did it so well. Cannabis prohibition has a history of racism. Early arguments in favor of prohibition were blatantly racist, meant to target Latinos and Black jazz musicians. Cannabis prohibition is certainly just one piece of a much larger problem in this country around policing and mass incarceration in our communities of color. And while legalization is going to help, address and repair that harm in Maryland specifically, there's still a long way to go when you look at the issue nationally. There's still 19 states that still impose jail time for simple possession. In 2019, there were over 600,000 arrests and citations for cannabis, which were more arrests than all violent crimes combined. And cannabis is probably the #1 pretext for stops and searches by law enforcement, which we know can be traumatic and at its worst deadly for Black and brown folks. So cannabis legalization is just one piece of a much broader criminal justice reform conversation we need to have in this country, but it's critical for more states to end cannabis prohibition.
Senator Hayes? Yeah, I think we can't adequately address this topic without looking at it through an economic lens. And, and that's one of the things that I've tried to zero in, as a legislator and serving as a member of the Senate Finance Committee. So let's talk a little bit about the opportunities for Black people to find equitable footing in the cannabis industry. And I'll open it up to either one of you or both of you to take that.
Sure. I mean, I could start. I feel like we've kind of touched on this a little bit, and it's an important question. And I know that this is top of mind for the Legislative Black Caucus in Maryland, because when you decide to legalize cannabis and create legitimate opportunities for its production and sale and generate millions of dollars, when that's something that folks have been engaged in for years and criminalized for it, it's really an injustice to ignore that history and that reality. And that's why what we call, equity in cannabis legalization is so important, so that those that have borne the brunt of this war on cannabis have an opportunity to rebuild their futures and to benefit from the newly legal industry. So, when we're talking about equity in terms of the economics of legalization, there's the front end, which is making sure that, there's Black business ownership and employment at every level of the industry. Unfortunately, in the states that have legalized thus far, we don't see nearly as much diversity and inclusion in the ownership of cannabis businesses that we'd like to see. But in practice, ensuring this type of equity can include things like making sure there's ample opportunity and not high barriers to enter the industry. If a state limits or caps the number of businesses to just a few per license category, that makes it much harder for folks without deep pockets and connections to compete and be successful. And I will also say on the back end, another piece that I believe you've raised in conversation, Senator Hayes, is that I think it's important sometimes to think about training and education in the industry for folks looking to enter the cannabis industry. So having programs at community colleges and HBCUs and high school CTE programs, things like that. So ownership and employment in the industry is critical and one piece of economic equity and legalization, but the other is community reinvestment that Davyon touched on a little bit. This is $1 billion industry. Washington State just brought in over $400 million last year in tax revenue. Colorado brought in over $300 million last year. So a big piece in equity and legalization is reinvesting a significant portion of that tax revenue into communities that have been most negatively impacted by prohibition. This is important to begin to, right past wrongs, but it's also important because not everyone who's been impacted by prohibition wants to be involved in the legal industry. In fact, many probably don't. So I think that this is a way to make sure that those folks are still able to benefit from the legal industry. And I think this is an opportunity to listen to those community needs and come up with some creative and substantive ways to reinvest into these communities, which I know that the Senate is doing in their legislation this year.
So I would say a few things. One, the average white family has 16 times the wealth of an average Black family. The wealth disparity is tremendous. And one of the impacts of that wealth disparity is that, as Olivia mentioned, it creates a tremendous barrier for Black folks to compete on a level at the highest levels of the industry. And so I think, government is important in figuring out interventions that can help to do something about that competitive disadvantage that Black folks are in. Additionally, because cannabis remains to be federally illegal, the access to federal dollars that might help to equalize some of that wealth disparity are not available because it's federally illegal. So there's certain banks that won't touch it, right? There's certain loans that aren't going to, loan because it's, again, federally illegal. So with those things being the case, there are two things I want to offer, just big picture things in order to address this. The first, and I want to, and again, I want to reiterate that this is something that doesn't just apply to cannabis, but I think it's about Black economic, the Black people's economic condition in general, which is that unfortunately there are very few what I call institutional containers to receive large sums of government dollars and distribute them effectively. Many of the large scale institutional containers that can receive large sums of federal dollars are not controlled by our community, right? And often happens is those resources are siphoned to, in a lot of cases, white-led nonprofit organizations or white companies who then may subcontract our folks or may hire a few of our folks in their institutional formations. And so one of the things that, and then the containers we do have just don't have the administrative infrastructure, don't have the capital, aren't sustainable in terms of their ability to properly steward that large sum of money. So I think it's important, just as a general piece, the importance of investing in those institutional containers, whether they be community development corporations, whether they be fiscal sponsorship or fiscal agency, institutions, CDFIs, the range of those containers need to be strengthened because it'll give us a place to put the dollars where we know it can go deep into the community. Whereas the problem we're in now is that there aren't very many entities where you put it there and that it's going to go directly into the community. Second thing is, and again, this is kind of me referencing what I mentioned earlier on the regulatory side, because I already talked about, and Olivia alluded to, the reinvestment piece, which we can do. This is going, for LBS, this is going to be one of our biggest priorities in terms of getting a bill that has that reinvestment piece in there, because there's no reason that it can't do it. And we haven't heard a better proposal that'll get money more directly to the community than kind of what we described in reinvestment in. So in terms of business, again, we have to figure out this challenge of not being able to use race specifically in policy, right? That is a huge challenge that we have to confront. And so that's probably going to require maybe not in the case of cannabis, but maybe it is, folks to do that and to take up the legal challenge and to take up that fight, because it relegates us to the current position of having to find ways to circumvent it as opposed to being able to just do it. And they are precedents. I mean, one of the things that I'm most proud of as a Baltimorean is the legacy of Perrin Mitchell, who in 1976 put, that set aside requirement on the Department of Defense budget where 10% of those contracts with the Black folks, you know what I'm saying? And so there's a history, in Baltimore recognizing the importance of economic development and using government policy as a way to use public dollars to help Black folks build wealth. And so I think that's really, when we think about government interventions, I think that's the piece. It's figuring out how to use the tools of government and legislation to give Black folks access to the kind of public dollars, because that's how a lot of white folks that have wealth, that's how a lot of them got wealthy. They began in the public sector, and then they were able to then use that as the basis for competition in the private sector. And so that is something that I think is going to be very important for us to address. Again, not just for cannabis, though it's important to provide the supports and infrastructure, but even going beyond that.
Yeah. No, thank you.
Yeah. This has been so rich. It's hard to contain it to an hour. So I want to make sure that we give you an opportunity to re-engage. So I'm going to offer the invitation at Coppin. I direct the Center for Strategic Entrepreneurship, and we have a lot of students who are watching and looking and wanting to learn and trying to find pathways to leadership and ownership, particularly in certain sectors and industries. And I think it's important for them to hear this so that they know that there are people such as yourself that are out, dissecting these issues and working on them to give them a sense of, okay, there is some hope for me to make a entry. But one last question for both. If you could do one thing that and wake up next year and everything would be okay, what would that do to solve the problem? What would that be? What's the magic? I don't know. I know there's no magic bullet, but what would be your solution that you would say would move the needle the furthest and get us where we need to be? And that's for either one of you.
I can go. When we go?
Sure.
So, magical bullet. I think, unfortunately, one of the problems is that Black people, we've been socialized not to negotiate and engage the larger society from a position of strength. And you get that mentality from having a knowledge of self, knowledge of being a person of African descent and all the cultural, historical resources that come as a result. And so when we think about what it means from a policy level, if we have as a community a strong knowledge of self, a strong love of self, a strong understanding of who we are as a community and the cultural resources, because I think unfortunately many times Black folks are socialized to see ourselves primarily as victims of oppression, as opposed to understanding the power and strength that comes from the bodies of work that our people have produced. And so I think that will provide us the attitude necessary to engage these policy questions from a position of understanding that we need to build power as a power base as a community, right? That if we're going to get access to the cannabis industry, if we can behave politically as a power base, that gives us the best opportunity to extract what we need to make sure our community gets what it deserves. But it's only when we have a strong knowledge of self and a commitment to ourselves and our community that we're able to negotiate and engage these larger policy fights. Again, not from a position of feeling like I got to beg somebody for anything, not feeling like these people in positions are entitled to us cowering to them, but us, again, being able to organize ourselves as a power base such that the policies that we've been talking about today are no-brainers, and that we don't have to rely on the benevolence of people outside of our community for it, but that we have the power to make those in positions of power do the things that are necessary for us to experience and practice freedom.
Wow, I mean, how do you follow up after that?
he set you up. He set you up.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have much more to offer, but as it pertains to cannabis legalization, I just want to see a Maryland where no one is criminalized and faces these harsh penalties for cannabis anymore. And, a state like Maryland that has a population of 30% Black people, that's no other state has that. So Maryland really has an opportunity to be a leader on this and get it right and build real generational wealth. So.
Yeah. The one thing that I'll say, Dr. Williams, and and for you all, I often, a lot of people are focusing on, there's 3 tiers or 3 opportunities to kind of participate in the industry. That's the growing aspect, the producing aspect, and then it's the dispensary. But oftentimes, and there's barriers to participating in any one of those 3 venues, right? A lot of it is having access to capital, which is traditionally, a barrier, especially as it relates to Black and brown folks in our community. But oftentimes, in having this conversation in community, we have some of the most ingenuity-centered minds in our community, right? And so I would employ, as you said, that students and others that at the university and that may be thinking about some of these things, there will be opportunities for alternative industries, right? Accessories to the industry that we should be considering and contemplating. Also, as I think our guests articulated, a lot of banks don't have the ability, it's heavy cash because the federal government won't insure banks to participate in this industry. And so creating other opportunities there. Also, many of the disciplines that are offered at Coppin State University, whether it's having, the computer scientists or the accountants and the other ancillary disciplines that are offered right there at the university, there may be opportunities there. And even most recently, Baltimore City Public Schools was revamping a lot of their career technology tracks, and they were looking at getting rid of agriculture. And I'm like, well, you might want to rethink that and look at, opportunities and, horticulture and stuff like that, because this may be a growing industry. So I think that's something that definitely students and others should be thinking about, as there will be opportunities to participate economically in what is going to be a new industry here in the state of Maryland.
Yeah, I think that's powerful. And as you said, the genius in the community, giving them an avenue. I've seen it for myself. And releasing that genius and pointing them in a particular reason, they'll figure a lot of things out. So I appreciate that. I appreciate our guests. Thank you so much. Please save the dates. April 28th and 29th is our Economic Inclusion Conference at Coppin. It's largely virtual, but we're connected to the high schools in our footprint, Carver, Coppin Academy right on our campus, Douglas right across the street, Edmondson. West Baltimore has every asset educationally and otherwise, BCCC's right there, that we need to really capture our young people and let them know that these opportunities exist. So I appreciate both of you. Thank you. And Senator, before we sign off, do you have anything else you would like to share about what's happening?
No, just, I enjoy participating in this platform with Dr. Williams as my co-host and representing one of the greatest institutions in the United States, Coppin State University, and the richness that all of that mean. I learned a very interesting fact today, and with the unveiling on Coppin's campus, and I think we talked about a little bit, Davyon, before you got on. But out of 110 historically Black colleges and universities, and
only one.
Only one, but they told me only 2 were named after African American females.
Yes,
right.
Was named after African American females.
Bethune-Cookman, and Fannie Jackson Coppin State.
Yeah. So I think that's just amazing, and so I am so blessed to have a connection to this institution and love the opportunity that's afforded to us to bring information to the community in this way. Thank you.
And I have to say this too, thinking about Fannie Jackson Coppin and the historical piece. A lot of people don't know her history. She was an entrepreneur. She was a businesswoman. She was an educator. She was a missionary. She was a woman on a mission. So, you know, we need to learn that. And she stood in Philadelphia in 1879 and said, listen, at a Freedmen's Bureau conference, and said, listen, we need to own our own and educate our own and be able to build our own businesses and flourish. So
and she wrote a book, and she wrote a book that people should read, Reminiscence of a School Life.
Yeah, yes.
1903.
Consummate educator, consummate educator. So thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to next time. Thank you, Senator. Well, save the dates. April 28th, 29th, Economic Inclusion Conference at Coppin. It's going to be large, huge. It's going to be great. So look forward to seeing you there. We'll share more information about that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank y'all.